Purview. We're going to talk about how those two tools work together, but we're also going to investigate some of what they do individually. There's a lot to get through, and I will try and show you what they look like and, talk you through some of that. Um, it's also hay fever season here in the UK, so that's why I'm a little bit nasal this morning. So I hope you can understand what I'm saying. Um, My name is Andrew Driver. I'm an instructor here at Readynez, and I'm going to take you through some of the core components of Defender XDR and Purview. We're also going to talk about the integration of Purview and Defender XDR because they do work very closely together, which is great from a security perspective. And I'll explain why and how that happens a bit later. We'll talk about investigation and response using that combined approach of using both sets of tools. And we'll also discuss how we can combine them in terms of investigation and why that's a good thing. Why having a tool that essentially looks outside the organization is really a good thing to have, because obviously we need to think about how we investigate things from within the organization, and also how we look at how external events such as incidents happening on the internet are affecting us as a business. So that's fairly critical. My background is Microsoft. Obviously, I'm a certified trainer and I've worked for Microsoft and done all sorts of things over the years. So I've learned that I don't know everything. So ask me anything you like at the end once we have a little bit of Q&A, and I'll do my best to answer the question. If I can't, then there will be resources. And I'll also point you at some additional resources in the form of the training materials, etc., which are available obviously through Readynez as well. So a fairly packed agenda to get through. So let's sort of go through and make sure we try and cover off as all of all of the content that we have to look at. So mitigating threats and mitigating incidents. Defender gives us several areas of work to work with. Now, you may have come across Defender in different guises before. We've had Defender for Cloud, Defender for 365, Defender for Identity, etc. Now, these Defender XDR is kind of like the workspace that covers all of that. So we can work with Defender for Identity, we can work with Sentinel, we can work with various different tools. Microsoft have been working very hard in the background to bring these tools into one place. Customers have continually said, why do we have several buckets to go to do different things? So we'll see this in all of the tools now as they come together to allow us to work in a unified environment. Purview does the same. With Purview, we have sort of security posture management, which has security posture management generally, but then there's also security posture for AI. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of the session. But basically, trying to bring things together makes it more unified and easier to work with. Obviously, within the portal in Defender, we've got the option to look at incidents, alerts, etc. We can go hunting for alerts based on criteria that we set. We can also view the secure score, etc. So there's lots of things we can do, and I'll go through some of those as we go through this session. Obviously, incident management is critical. Incident management is how we work towards that zero trust approach. Remember, Microsoft's zero trust philosophy, if you like, or approach, is about assuming breach in one case, minimizing sharing, so basically only giving privileges which are required, and also verifying explicitly. So making sure that people are verifying who they are and authenticating correctly and appropriately in the organization. So, explicit verification, least privilege, and assuming breach are three good pillars upon which to build your security stance. We cannot assume that we are safe because we never are, sadly. So we have to assume that somebody is trying or has already got into our organization. And on that basis, if we do that, we'll have much more chance of catching incidents sooner rather than later, because that's what we're trying to do all the time. We're trying to make sure that we're picking up problems before they become a major incident. So an incident in Defender terms is a collection of things which have a connected story, if you like. So essentially it is this happened, then something else happened, and then something else. Now, if we take it from if we add Purview to this mix, that's where it becomes really interesting, because with Purview, you have the ability to do things like insider risk. You can start to look at data loss prevention. You can see where there's attempted exfiltration of data. Now, if you correlate that with Defender threats, then you can start to see a sort of a connection between what is happening on the internet, what is happening in the outside world in terms of threats. And don't forget the threat intelligence that Microsoft gather, which is, billions of terabytes of data and signals and all sorts every day, which is correlated into the tooling. If you look at that, then you can say, okay, if there's a relationship between what's happening outside, I can see what's happening in my organization. So we can start to relate those things, because they might not immediately seem related. Why do I care about what's happening on the internet when I'm dealing with this problem here? But actually, they are connected. And so making up the story involves not just Defender, but also any other related Defender services, such as Defender for Identity, Defender for 365, etc. We can then go through and investigate. And what this helps us to do is start to look more at indicators of compromise elsewhere. Remember, indicators of compromise are how we get signals and notifications, and also the sense that there's something happening beyond what we've seen. In other words, we don't simply want to be dealing with what we know. We've got to have some knowledge of what might happen next. And we can do this through Purview, for instance, with pattern matching. We can see trends of activity. We can capture that through Defender XDR as well. So, for instance, a really simple example would be if you capture the activity around badge usage in an organization. So when you go to an organization, to your building, you swipe in with your badge and you go in. Now, if there's related activity around exfiltration attempts of data, which correlate to badge activity for certain individuals, then we can start to look in more detail at what they're doing. Now, that's a very simple example, and it isn't always as easy as that, as we know, but you can start to correlate activities and incidents together to start to build patterns of activity. Now, the root cause analysis, obviously, is where we can gather information about what's going on underneath our environment, what's happening in the background that we're not maybe fully aware of. And that's where we can start to look at things like hunting. And Defender allows us to go through and hunt based on certain criteria, and we can inspect our environment to see where the gaps are. Remember, we're trying to plug those gaps all the time, and Purview helps us to do that from the inside out through governance and incident management, and Defender XDR helps us to do that too. And we're also looking as well at potential threats. And this is a very simple example of what that hunting might look like, where we can do a combination of coding through KQL. We can also go in and use additional signals from the other elements of Defender to give us a clearer picture of what's actually happening and the time frame. And this again is where we can start to correlate incidents to see what is happening and what other things are happening at the same time. All of this is trying to find patterns of incident management, which also in Purview helps us to then look at intent. Because if we're looking at something which is consistently happening repeatedly over a period of days or weeks, then we can start to correlate whether that is simply somebody doing something by mistake, because it's just something they don't understand, or they maybe they have other issues, maybe they need some education and training, or is it a consistent and planned approach to managing our network and trying to gain access? And of course, remember that hackers are obviously using different patterns of access, and we need to be cognizant of that too. So this is where we start to capture other elements, not just things like patterns of incident, but also correlated incidents elsewhere. The secure score in Defender is one of the ways that I've found working with customers to give people a more compelling view of what's happening. Because what you can see here is a statistic showing you the level of security around your organization, but also giving you insights into how to make it better. The one thing about Secure Score is, showing something that's a problem is one thing, but actually having some guidance on how to make it better is another. And of course, Secure Score is related to the type of business. So organizations can look at this and compare themselves with other organizations of a similar size or vertical or whatever, and then gain guidance about how much they need to sort of change. Secure 100% security, as we know, is not possible because as soon as we think we're secure, something happens. So we need to be moving forward all the time to a more secure posture. So are you ever going to get to 100% is irrelevant, really, as a question. What you're trying to do is ensure that you're taking the best effort to manage things in the best way. So, for instance, the first place to start would be multi-factor authentication. That would immediately improve a score like this. But it's also around working with other technologies because no organization has just one vendor internally. They may have the majority of one particular vendor, but they've more likely got other things. And also, they have other things outside the organization, so cloud-based applications. So we need to consider that as well, and that will all feed into our secure score. I mentioned earlier on that Microsoft capture sort of billions of signals every day, and this is all fed in through threat intelligence. And threat analytics is looking at us compared to what's going on around us. So is there something that we need to be aware of? And it's correlating those questions and correlating those signals to help us get better visibility into how we're doing. So that's a very sort of quick look through what Defender shows us. Now let's have a look at Purview, because Purview has been around for a while now, and the Purview portal, incidentally, has evolved and changed and is continuing so to do. So it's very important to know that when we look at content like this today, we need to be aware that in a month or less, things will have changed. New abilities will be there. Preview products will now be in GA. So be aware of that, especially as well if you go to the Microsoft YouTube channel and look at Microsoft Mechanics and things like this. Do look at the dates of these videos, because if they're anything more than 3 or 4 months out of date, then they're likely maybe showing you things that aren't there anymore, or maybe showing you an interface that's subtly different. So do be aware that these things change. But the Purview portal has now moved from a classic view, which is still available, and there are differences between the way they work, but they both take you to the same place, more or less, and the new portal, which you can see on the screen here. And I'll show you briefly the portal as we go into the demo later on. The different solutions that we have involve content searching. Now, this is e-discovery. E-discovery has been around for a while and used to be very much focused around Exchange, but is now very much around looking at what is happening when we need to investigate further if there's been a compromise of data inside the organization. And this is where intent becomes even more important to think about, because we don't want to treat every single infringement as a massive issue, because it isn't. It might simply be that somebody needs telling how to do something, which is why communication and training has to be part of all these processes. When we talk about implementing Purview, we talk about implementing the teams in the business. So it isn't just about IT, it isn't just about HR, it's about everything else as well. And we need to be cognizant of that when we're doing our communication plans, when we're training, when we're delivering a service, and also when we're doing proactive, ongoing education. And part of that is feedback, having robust feedback mechanisms to allow organizations and individuals in the organization as well to feed back about their experience. I worked in support, and there's nothing more saddening than when you speak to somebody about an incident they're experiencing, and when you say, how long has this been happening? And they say, oh, a few months. And you ask the question as gently as you can, why didn't you report it before? And they say, well, I just thought that was the way it was, or I thought it was me, or I didn't. People need to have a knowledge that they can feedback, but more importantly, that their feedback is listened to and used and responded to. So, having all of that is really important. The auditing solutions in Purview are also critical to be able to manage events. And there are two different flavors. There's standard versus preview, which obviously is a licensing question. DLP, data loss prevention, we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through, but DLP is about understanding where our data is and also looking after that data in terms of encryption, etc., no matter where it is. So being able to do that is a critical part of data management. And of course, insider risk, looking at the internal usage, looking at internal employees. And this isn't to suggest that every employee in an organization needs monitoring and managing in the sense that they might try to do something bad, but there are potential risks involved in certain types of jobs. So, for instance, salespeople who travel a great deal outside the organization with their devices, with their data, are simply more at risk because of the nature of how they work. In Microsoft, most of the employees have no physical location. They have mobile as their location, which means they work in customer sites, Microsoft offices, coffee shops, you name it. And at home, of course, insider risk because everybody's working at home, or a great percentage of people were during COVID. That is risky unless you can put things in place to manage that. And so that's really where insider risk is coming from. Looking at DLP is, there are lots of different aspects to this. So first of all, we need to know what we need to protect. Do we necessarily need to protect certain things? This is where we think about appropriate protection. Appropriate protection really is saying, this is my organization type, this is my type of data, therefore this is what I need to do, versus another business that doesn't need to do that. So, we can't have a one size for everybody. That doesn't work. So you have to be able to make appropriate judgments and understand what you've got. And you can only do that if you know what you've got to protect. And then preventing things being shared that shouldn't. How do we do that? How do we do that sympathetically? Because remember, from a governance and security perspective, it's a thin line between being appropriate and secure and protecting and getting in the way of people performing their jobs. So we have to be aware of that too. And it's a fine balance sometimes. And this is where communication comes in as well, because if we can explain to the users why certain things have been put in place, then there's more likelihood that they will understand and buy into, and of course work with that, because compliance and governance security is everybody's responsibility. It isn't just something that cascades down from the IT department or whatever. It is everybody's responsibility to take account of that. Monitoring how data is being used, understanding, how we put in place certain things, all of that is important. And how do we put DLP in place? Well, we can use sensitive information types. Microsoft provide many out of the box, but obviously an organization may have its own types of sensitive information. We can use labeling such as confidential, secret, general, etc., to indicate the level of protection. And those labels can enforce certain things like identification. You could watermark a sensitive document. We've got policies which enable us to put this sort of protection across containers like SharePoint directories. And of course, we've got Defender for Cloud Apps file policy. And Defender for Cloud Apps is something which is enabled through Defender as well. And this, of course, allows us to work not just with our own applications, but with applications that are on the internet. And so, we can have a much more holistic view of what's going on as an organization. The DLP alerting piece, as you can see on this slide, feeds into two places. Purview, obviously, because that's where we set these things up and put the policies in place, but also Defender, because that then helps us to go from something happening in Purview that's spotted, an alert, which then goes through to be an incident in Defender. And then we can bring to bear all of the Defender capability, including threat intelligence, hunting, etc., to allow us to get more insights into what's actually happening. So it's very useful to think of those two areas. We have two separate levels of incident that we can manage, but we have one holistic view of it by a combined view of that information coming through into Defender and Purview. And then, like I said on that previous slide, they complement each other because you're not looking at simple duplication. That's not what it is. It is rather showing us two separate views of things, Because if I look at something in the context of just my organization, then I'll have one perspective about it. If I look at things in the context of the outside world through Defender, then I'll have a different concept and a different context. So it's important to have those two separate areas to look at. When we look at alert life cycle, and I won't go through all of this because we haven't got time, but basically there are several things that happen when alerts are generated. And so at this point, we can start to think, okay, how do we do this? How do we manage this? So we can set up alerts through DLP. We can decide on what type of alerts, what sets an alert. We can decide what the trigger is going to be, because we want to eliminate the noise as much as we can. And obviously what we need to do is make sure that we're capturing enough information to be useful. And of course, the type of information we can capture and how much all depends to a certain extent on the licensing that we're using. Then we can start to look at the investigation aspect through the Purview portal. We can start to manage our data. There's a length of time that data is stored within Purview, which is slightly different than in Defender. So in Defender, we get more longevity. We can store things for a longer period. In both cases, we can take the data and put it somewhere else as well. So we do have the option to export. So looking through with Purview, think of Purview as being the sort of immediacy and Defender as the bigger picture. When we start to look at Defender, we can then start to retain data for up to 6 months. Now, our retention policies may be much longer than that. And this is, of course, where we can start to then look at how we can use data retention within Purview itself. But in terms of the incidents we're working with, we have much more time to look at these things, and we can basically go into Defender environment and correlate activities against other things. So for instance, I mentioned earlier on about different types of activity. We can add connectors to Purview, which will allow us to look at HR-based things. So for instance, if somebody's role is at risk or if their job is at risk, this will be an HR-related thing. And that can feed through to into Purview in terms of DLP and insider risk, so that we can then know that this person or this team is at risk for that reason. And like I said, this isn't about, pointing the finger or accusing people of being crooked, I suppose. But it's what it's really about is saying, okay, there is a potential risk here which we have to acknowledge. We have to acknowledge that because that's just simply the way it is. If my users, for instance, are working outside the organization and spending most of their time in coffee shops using the Wi-Fi, I have to treat them as risky. I have to treat them as potentially at risk, because not because they are as individuals, but because of what goes on around them. Increasingly social networking is becoming a way that hackers and bad actors are getting into organizations. There was an incident recently reported in the press where somebody was at an event and somebody else gained access to them. And that's something we have to be very aware of. With response to DLP alerts, we can update the status, we can investigate it initially within Purview. We can also manage if there's anything else we need to think about, any other areas of Purview we need to bring in. In Defender, we can assign the alert to an owner and start to advance triage and also then correlate with any other events, because obviously a lot of these things don't happen in isolation. So we can start to dig in and get more view of what's going on. With Purview policies, insider risk is critical. So understanding what types of risks there are. And there's a lot of things to think about on these slides. I'm not going to go into all of those because we haven't got time, but you can imagine that there are, all sorts of violations potentially for all sorts of reasons. So we need to consider all of that and understand that there could be differences between what is happening, and we need to sort of capture as much as we can. Remember, the MITRE ATT&CK framework in terms of incident management looks at everything from reconnaissance all the way through to data exfiltration, and that's what we can do as well. The workflow process, and again, this is fairly standard. There's a workflow for most of these things. The policy would trigger off an alert. We would then investigate by triage first of all to make sure that it's something worth taking to the next level, and then if so, it then becomes something which we investigate and then take action as appropriately. And down the bottom there, the collaboration piece is important on that slide, because we're not looking at one area of the business when we start to look at investigation. It's important to remember that, because we're not simply looking at, okay, this is an HR thing, or this is a legal thing, or this is an IT thing. It's across the organization. And it's important to get that stakeholder buy-in when we start to put standards like these in place. Managing the policies, obviously, you've got the policy templates, which are there as guides, and you can obviously create your own and put in your own settings, but you do have these as initial guides to sort of help start an organization off. Departing employee data theft. If somebody's leaving in a month and suddenly their OneDrive is emptying, that's an indication of something going on. Data leaks. If people have, if there's some sort of data leakage based on other events which have been happening. New things, and like I said, preview tooling is quite often in preview, and then it will become a preview product that goes to GA. Health record misuse. So in the health sector, we have to be cognizant of that. So there's a lot of connectors to that area as well. Risky browser usage, which would include AI, because we can put browser monitoring in place, so endpoint protection, where we can monitor browsers. Edge, by the way, is covered already, and don't forget there's the business Edge version as well. But risky browser usage could be exfiltrating data through the browser. That's one of the most common techniques that are used. It can also involve using non-sanctioned AI. So if the organization is using Copilot, but somebody is trying to use ChatGPT, the internet-based version, not the one that comes within Copilot, then that would be an issue. And so we need to think about that too. And of course, there'd be other things like, how do we pick up these things? Well, we have to have some indicator. Not everything is a problem. Some things might not be a problem. They're a false positive. How do we manage the time frame for our policies, etc.? Defender for cloud apps, I mentioned previously, this is where we can start to really manage our shadow IT. Now, we'll talk about shadow AI in a moment, but shadow IT obviously is where people are using unsanctioned storage. They're using unsanctioned applications. Or conversely, you have companies where they want people to use a particular cloud-based solution, and they want to verify that people are doing that. And so you can use Defender for cloud apps to protect your data that way as well. There's also the idea of protecting data wherever it lives. So if I do have information in another cloud and I want to ensure that my data is protected, I can protect not just the data itself, but also the transport process. I can start to sort of manage how I get to that data and what else happens to it. I can impose DLP on my cloud data as if it were data living in my own organization. I can start to put the same protection and compliance management around my data, no matter where it lives. And this, of course, is also a Purview function, because Purview and Defender for Cloud Apps work together to give you this approach of protecting and applying insider risk management, DLP policies, e-discovery, etc. All of the things that you need to manage, no matter where your data lives. The cloud discovery, of course, is critical, because within the Defender cloud discovery piece, it shows you what cloud you're using. As I mentioned before, you might want people to be using a certain thing, but maybe they can't. You might want people to be not using certain things. Like an organization I worked with recently, people were putting stuff into Dropbox because there was no mechanism for them to do things another way that worked for them. And the company hadn't yet put something in place to allow them. And so, that is something which we need to address. AI is a perfect example of that. Shadow AI is becoming a challenge. The statistic about ChatGPT going to 1 million users in a week is both indicative of people's desire to use these tools, but also concerning from the perspective of people using them in a business where AI is not yet sanctioned, or maybe they're using a different tool. So we need to be aware of that. And we can only do that through some sort of cloud discovery piece. And then we can start to take the appropriate action once we have that visibility. The other thing we have is the ability to put in controls which relate back to conditional access, which of course is an Entra thing, Entra ID. And we can then start to put in conditional access application controls on top of that. So conditional access on its own, as you probably know, is the ability to control people's access to the corporate environment based on certain criteria, which could be the device they're using, the level of update it's at, the time of day, the IP address they're from, etc. So we can apply additional controls to monitor sessions for compliance, to allow or deny access, to put in additional steps. So, for instance, traditionally, before MFA became more of a permanent feature, we could impose MFA as part of conditional access. Now, of course, it's advised to have it in place all the time. And of course, MFA with anti-phishing is the next level. We can also incorporate protection around file labeling. So we talked about DLP and sensitivity labels. So if a file is labeled as confidential, we need to ensure that we're actually treating that with the same and appropriate sort of standards that we need to. And so conditional access is part of that process as well. And of course, it's also really about protecting our sensitive information. So what do we have? First of all, how do we classify it appropriately? How do we protect it based on that classification? And how do we monitor to make sure that we're doing it right? You know, we have this approach with DLP where we put policies in place, but we don't turn them on straight away. What we do is we initially run a simulation, and the simulation tells us whether we're being effective. And we run this through a testing process. And this again, and I talk about this a lot, but it comes back to the investigation and the education for users. Education is critical when you're putting in processes like this, particularly those ones with which users will interact. You know, it's different when there are settings that people don't even know are there and they just get on with their day job. But when you're working with settings which do affect the users with which they need to interact, that they need to have at least a peripheral understanding of, then you've got to give them education to help them get through that. And part of that process would be putting in policies, see what was going on, educating people as they're working through these. And then once we're happy with all of that, we'd go from simulation to full production mode. And then we can start to enforce more rigorously what we need to. And of course, we can do this across all the devices people use, whatever devices they might be. We can do it through cloud services. And of course, we have the ability to do this on premises. So, you know, organizations have a lot of content on-prem that they still want to interact with or at least manage. And therefore, we can do that. We can give that data the same level of protection that we give our interactive cloud-based data as well. Now, I mentioned at the top of this session that there are different flavors of Defender. And basically, there's Defender for Identity, which allows us to manage how our identities are used. And this, of course, also applies to on-premises identities. So if we're still using something like Active Directory domain services on premises, and we have something more like federation services between that environment and the cloud, we can start to protect that too. This is where we can put in a more holistic approach for those things that we still need to support, because obviously a lot of organizations do have legacy environments. And when I say legacy, what I mean is they're using older authentication methods like Kerberos or NTLM. They're not necessarily able to remove that estate. There are ways around it. You can move into the cloud and you can use Entra domain services and all those things, but you know, maybe an organization simply can't do that. So you have to have mitigation processes, and this is where identity control, Defender for Identity will help, because it can give you a more uniform way of dealing with identities from different places, and also not just legacy Microsoft, but also third party. So if you've got third-party identities, so people coming in through different means, authenticating with different services. You can verify all of that as well. And of course, you can deploy it across the organization relatively quickly using sensors to look at where the data is coming in from and understand what needs to be done to actually manage the identities that are part of that. Now, I couldn't talk about technology without mentioning AI, and I've already mentioned it once or twice, but essentially Purview has a capability now to help us manage AI transactions and AI interactions very effectively. But the main point to remember is it doesn't use anything different. It doesn't use specific tools that are only AI based. It is now using the same tools that we use for traditional types of data. So, for instance, with DLP, you might protect some data from leaving the business. You can do the same with prompts. You can do the same with AI responses. And you can do the same with any data that's generated by AI. Remember, the amount of data which is basically being created by user interactions with AI tools is phenomenal. And it becomes something that we now have to protect. And that includes also assessing whether or not we can remove it, because the ability to understand whether we can remove something, when do we need to, how long should we keep something, and what happens next is critical. And as we create more and more content through AI, we have to be aware that that's something we need to do for the AI interactions as well. The challenge, obviously, with using AI tools is that sometimes businesses don't know what tools people are using. You know, it's fair to say that there was a report recently that said in I think it was Fortune 500 companies, something like 40% of them had people using AI that they didn't know about. So they know people are doing it because it's inevitable, but they don't know what they're using or for what or how. And so you have to put protections in place to understand that and have visibility of that. Um, Data exposure is a critical thing, and this happens through the browser. So, like I said, putting in the browser extensions if you don't have Edge for Business is important. And there's extensions for Chrome and Firefox. Those are the two key ones. And of course, compliance risks. If a user is using sensitive data in a prompt to generate more data, that data is potentially sensitive because of where it came from and what was used to generate it. Therefore, how do we protect that? And this is something which you can do. So you've got various ways of protecting AI generated data. There is something called data security posture management for AI. Now, in the Purview portal, you'll see that there are DSPM, and there's also DSPM for AI, and it puts classic in brackets. And I'll show you what it looks like in a moment. Essentially, now we've got one place. DSPM is there for everything. So it's not just our on-premises services, our traditional SharePoint, OneDrive kind of environments. It's also there for our AI transactions. And this helps us to apply protections to enable us to say, okay, we're going to treat our prompts, our responses, and our generating content in the very same way that we will protect the data that we traditionally create through Word, Excel, etc., and that we store in places like SharePoint. So we can apply the same sort of centralized visibility and control over everything that we do. We're not just talking about Copilot, obviously. Like I said, we've got the option to do this for everything. So every cloud-based AI that people are using. And of course, if an organization has other types of AI, so maybe they've implemented a particular AI tool internally with an SLM, a small language model, then potentially that's something we could cover as well. Any governance. So this bit here where it says applies labeling DLP and governance. If somebody uses a document that's labeled confidential as part of a prompt, the response that Copilot or the AI will deliver is also marked as confidential. So preserving that chain of command, that chain of classification is really important. And that's something else we can do with Purview. And of course, as I mentioned before, all of this is consistent across the organization. We don't need to change the way we do things. We don't need specific tools just for AI. We're leveraging what we already have. And of course, this is just how we would go through and secure. So we first of all, we need to know what people are using, which we can do. Defender for Cloud Apps can provide us with more of that knowledge. Protecting content using the tools that Purview gives us, so DLP, insider risk. Governing it by managing responses and understanding what's being generated and where it is. And then, of course, looking for anything that's not compliant. And there are some amazing tools to be able to use in there, such as Communications Manager, where we can go not just to the prompt, but into the wording, and we can start to use nuances as well. We can really start to dig into the intent behind it, because like I said earlier on, intent is critical. Not everything is a firefight. Not everything is a massive emergency. And we can understand that if we understand the intent. So, for instance, we can understand whether it was simple incompetence where someone did something or whether it was intention to defraud. So, we need to be able to understand that very clearly. And of course, we need to be able to protect across the environment, no matter what AI people are using. So if an organization is bringing various things in, we need to have governance across all of those as well. Now, we've come to the question piece, and I want to just quickly sort of address a question there that Lucia put in. A clear overview of the Purview functions in Business Premium versus Purview licenses, and how Purview gives extra value to the customers that already have Business Premium. So that's an interesting one, and it's basically licensing. I'll be perfectly candid, is not my area. It used to be back in the day because I had to when I worked at Microsoft, but I wouldn't say that I'm a licensing expert. So my suggestion would be to go into the licensing portal in Microsoft to actually have that conversation with them. As far as a clear overview is concerned, I'm not entirely sure there is any such thing for licensing as a clear overview, because obviously it varies so quickly and so rapidly. And Microsoft do make changes quite regularly. There was a massive change recently, for instance, with Copilot licensing versus the free chat versus the paid chat or the paid 365. So I don't want to mislead you and send you down the wrong route by trying to tell you from my perspective. All I will say is that licensing for Purview, and I got this from a Microsoft person just recently at an event I was running, is under review. And there are new things coming in. There are changes happening. There are updates to the tool itself. There are additional capabilities, and all of these are being licensed in a slightly different way. So there are changes on the way. So that's probably the best place to leave that, because like I said, it's something which you'll need to go in and I would suggest, if you have access to one, having the conversation with your licensing partner. So if you have a provider that's giving you services, including licensing, it's their job to dig that knowledge out. So I'd really leverage them if you can. Before I go into any more of those, I just quickly wanted to give you a view of these, because I know I've talked about them and I'm assuming that some of you will have seen these. This is the Go Deploy training course that we deliver at Readynez. So we do SC 401. There are other courses which cover Defender and Purview, SC 200 for instance, but I use this one because I deliver it a lot nowadays, because people are concerned about managing their compliance across AI tools, for instance, and governance has become front and center of conversations that people are having around protecting data. So essentially, you've got your Purview portal. This is the new Purview portal. So I'll just, give you a quick tour of what this looks like. As you can see, I've got Copilot up here as well. So Copilot is enabled as part of this process. Down the side here, I've got the various areas that I might want to manage. So if I go to settings, I can go to the data connectors piece. I can look at any connectors that I want to add, which could include on-premises connectors as well. Just noticed MBR's question in there with on-prem file servers. What we would need with file servers is we'd need to have the connection down to our on-premises environments. Purview handles the authentication part of that. We have a service that runs on premises, so the Purview connector runs on a server on-prem. We need a SQL platform to be able to manage the data, so we understand what we have, and obviously SharePoint on premises as well. So it's really designed for SharePoint servers running on-prem. With file servers, I'm not sure is the honest answer. It is something which I would need to sort of go into and ask Purview whether it can do that. But I know that there is a lot of capability now around on-prem if we combine this with endpoint services through Defender as well. So remember, with that, we can start to gather not just the data. We're not managing the data per se, but we're also managing the insights and the incidents related to that data. So to a certain extent, to your question, we can put in certain things around on-premises data in terms of the sort of monitoring and capability. Whether we can do the deepest granularity of in terms of encryption, etc., does depend. There are some dependencies there. So let me just very quickly, while we're here, just do a search. So Purview on-prem. So basically, the self-hosted piece is really about adding our data to services on premises. And this is something which I came across the other day when somebody else asked the same question. So I'm like I said, this is not my knowledge, this is somebody else's, but what I will do is just put that in the chat so that it's there for you to have a dig into and maybe sort of search around that subject. While I'm here, actually, I want to just do this, which is put in the link to these courses, because the material I've talked about today, a lot of it has been based, or most of it's been based around this course, the SC401. So this is one of the courses that we teach, and it's 4 days, and it goes through compliance and governance across everything, and covers off Copilot and AI generally as well. The other course, which is another one that we do here, is SC200. Just get rid of that. And SC200 is again, all about the security tools. It's being updated. There will be a new version of this fairly soon. And Microsoft have basically added new capabilities around AI, etc. in here. But again, it's a really useful course. And this, if you've not used Learn, and I'm sure most of you on the call have at some point dipped into here, then this is a very useful place to go to get information about particular solutions. This one, for instance, here is about a particular certification. So there is an exam associated with it, same as with 401. There's also, there's lots of stuff that we deliver here which isn't exam related. Most of the Copilot training I'm doing at the moment isn't necessarily exam related. But if there is an exam, then it will give you information about the exam. It'll tell you what sort of things to think about. But there's also a learning path. And so you can go through here and you can go and do the learning, which will also potentially include some sandboxed simulations. So the simulations are limited, obviously, because they can't give you everything, because they'll just give you a particular task. But the sandboxed environment will give you an actual subscription. So depending what Microsoft are doing with this training, they will give you something like that in here. So these can be very useful as future reference. Another question from MBR there. So for an organization migrating to the cloud from Entra, which one would you recommend the IT ops and security staff take for learning to use the cloud apps? That's a good question. So I think from the potential, well, they cover two separate areas in fairness. They're both SC courses, so security curriculum, but the SC 401 is very much about governance. It's very much about Purview solely. The SC 200 is more about security tooling generally. So it covers everything: Defender, Sentinel, Security Copilot, all of those things. Um, from a migration perspective, there are Azure courses. So there's the sort of AZ401 or AZ100 or 104, I think it is now, which covers the migration of tools or the migration of platforms from an Active Directory on-premises environment into a cloud-based world, and also how to run them side by side, because there are tools now that Microsoft provide within Entra which will help you to run on-premises Active Directory domain services style connectivity within the cloud. So there is a service that will now provide Kerberos and similar authentication methods for legacy services, and it's intended for those businesses that want to go cloud-based but can't necessarily convert everything to cloud capability, if that makes sense, in terms of the programming net frameworks, etc. So there are some of those things as well. So there are various options within the Purview portal. So for instance, if we go here, we've got compliance. If we go down to DSPM, we've got DSPM for AI, but we also now have DSPM. And this is a fairly recent change that came in the last, well, I'm trying to remember now, not that long ago. And what this does is it allows us to put in protection from a security posture perspective for everything, not just for AI, but for everything. And so we can start to go in here and secure our data, secure our agents. And incidentally, the Copilot protection doesn't just apply to prompt response that users do within the browser. It also applies to agents in Copilot Studio as well as Foundry. So whatever an organization is doing, they can see things that their users are doing. They can also see things that agents are doing. And of course, this also includes agents which talk to outside services through APIs. So if you've got an agent which is designed to interact with something based on the cloud, you still can monitor it and manage it through Purview, Defender XDR, and DSPM. So, there's a massive amount of flexibility to be able to protect data wherever it lives. From a Defender perspective, like I said, Defender is becoming this unified portal that provides everything. So we've got, all the usual suspects that you would see in here. We've got things like Secure Score, which of course, in my case, in this demo environment, will be very, very slim. But we can see that there are things that we need to protect, and we can also see areas where we might need to put in some additional work. We can improve our score, and then that will take us to a place where we can start to look at the recommendations that Microsoft is offering us. And this is one of the places where, I've gone into customers on many occasions and talked about this. And some of them, I remember one in particular, they turned on Defender, but they hadn't really done anything with it. And so we went in for a session one day to discuss how they might leverage it and what they might be doing next, and sort of help them with some advice. And they went into the portal for probably one of the first times ever, and they looked at Secure Score. And the Secure Score they had, it was, I think, low 50s. Excuse me. And this was quite concerning, inevitably. So they were able to go in quite quickly and understand, okay, what is it I need to do? What can I do that's going to give me some quick wins, that's going to help me protect myself most adequately. And this is also before we had vulnerability management, because that's another layer of security around it, because something can be secure but still vulnerable. So we need to understand how to treat that. It's like I travel for work, and I travel to a lot of different places. My device is secure, my account is secure, remembering that we're never 100%, but we can try. But even with that, there is still some vulnerability. So I have a secure device, but if I'm working in an external environment, it's vulnerable. And so we need to have that layer of granularity when it comes to understanding what we're protecting and also how. So this is, looking at our sort of secure score can be a useful place to go. We also have the option to incorporate things like Sentinel, because Sentinel is ultimately going to be part of Defender completely. There is still, that Microsoft is still transitioning to that world where they've got Sentinel incorporated in here 100%, but we can start to see that we can incorporate things like threat management, we can start to bring in content management, and a lot of the information as well, remember, is all about the threat intelligence that Microsoft gather. So the knowledge about what's happening in the world, because if there are sudden IP address ranges at risk that weren't before, that is an issue which could potentially affect us internally in the business. If there is activity of a certain type in our environment, if we're a global organization, that may be something which could influence what's going on with us. So we need to be aware of that. We need to have that visibility, and we can get that through here. And then, of course, as always, there is the option to go in and look at things like SOC optimization, which is where we can start to go in and understand how can we help our SOC be more efficient? Where can we optimize? Where can we add additional value? Where can we start to build in more knowledge? And of course, as with all of these, there are, lots of different resources that we can add in. And if we go into Defender itself, we can see the sort of the linkage between Defender and the other tooling, because here we can start to incorporate data within Purview, Entra, etc. And most of this, of course, is done automatically, but we can also add in other services should we need to ensure that we're able to work with all of our tooling. So here, for instance, I can open the Purview portal from here, or I could go into my device management space and work with those, or I could look at the Azure Security Center all up and understand what's going on in my cloud platform. So that's, I need to authenticate against my app, so that's fine. But that's basically a very sort of rapid overview. I suppose the main point is that Defender and Purview might be, thank you, I appreciate that. Thanks, MBR. We look at Defender on one hand as being the security tool, and then we think of Purview as being the compliance and governance. And they are two different things. They're two separate areas, but they also have a commonality and a connection. And if you're combining the capabilities of Defender XDR and Purview, you kind of, I'll never ever say you'll be perfectly secure, because it doesn't exist, sadly, but you have a really good step to protecting from different perspectives. Remember earlier on, there was a slide where I said that it gave you perspective view of the data. We capture incidents into Purview, but we look at them in Defender as well to get another perspective, to see another view, because that's going to affect what we do next, how we affect something, how we work with something. And obviously, it's really important to have as detailed a view as we can of the data that we've got, of the incidents that we're seeing, so that we can then make intelligent choices about what we do next. We don't want to be working on one basis because we've simply missed something else that's really critical to us, which would affect our judgment and affect what we do next. And what's interesting as well, in Purview, one of the things that we do, particularly with e-discovery and analytics, is we have the ability to bring in human teams, because humans are the ones with intuition who can look at things and infer results. And also, quite often, those people who have the relationships with the people that are being managed and the environment that they're in. And so it's not all technology based. There's aspects where, with things like Purview cases, where you're gathering data, maybe there's some litigation that's taking place. So you gather all the information you have into one thing called a case. Humans are the people who analyze that. I hope you found today useful. It's been a run through quite rapidly through lots of quite complex stuff, and I appreciate the challenge when you're dealing with that. There's additional training obviously available through the Readynez website. Please visit that and have a look through, see if anything appeals. There are other webinars that run as well. I run quite a few. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you attending. I hope you found it useful. And I hope my voice was clear enough as well. enjoy the rest of your day, and maybe I'll catch you on another one of these. I'll hang around for a minute or two in case there are any other questions. So thanks again.